So, thank you very much for joining me. Obviously, I know you all, right, but our audience may not. So, I'd like you just to introduce yourselves and just kind of tell the audience what you do. John, we might as well start with you.
My name's John Thompson. I'm the MD of F3C Advantage. I head up CAS UK, Complete Advisory Solution, and we work with practices large and small about helping them systemize how they deliver advisory services to their clients and prospects.
Thank you very much, John. Glenn.
Hi, Glenn Collins. I'm from ACCA. I head up technical and advisory for ACCA. I also look after a bit of policy, and I lead on some of the SMP work that we're actually doing. Quite a nice, varied, and interesting role.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Brian.
Brian Coventry. I'm the CEO and founder of Symphony APS. We focus on large accounting firms in the UK and the US, principally around CRM, change management, integration and automation.
Brilliant. Martin?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Bissett, founder of the Bissett Group. I've spent the last 22 years working with small to medium-sized accounting firms to solve their practice development issues, from talent to fee growth to marketing and beyond.
Brilliant. And Jenny?
Hi, my name's Jenny Strudwick. I am a senior product manager at Iris. I worked in accountancy practice for about 3.5 years before joining Iris, and I've been there for about 17 years now, sort of heavily involved in our MTD program at the moment.
Brilliant. So, our panelists. Right, well, let's get started. We're going to, throughout today, I'm going to go through and ask our panelists some of the questions, but you guys have probably got some questions as well, right? So please use the app, put some questions into Slido within the app, and then what we'll do is we'll go for about half an hour, and then we'll jump to your questions. So let's start with what we all do as a living, right? We deal with compliance, with legislation. I don't know about anybody else, but we've seen wave upon wave of legislation recently, but I don't know, it feels like a little bit of a quiet period. Glenn, is there any insight you feel?
I think we've had the storm yesterday, haven't we? And there's always a phrase, there's a slight lull before a storm. And if you look at some of the policy areas, actually people were caught up with planning for Brexit. That will run through next year. But actually, there is also a massive catch-up. And we see that catch-up coming through in terms of data, in terms of HMRC actually looking at a wide number of new and different areas. So I would go the lull before the storm. And I'm not saying that with any joy at all, because it's you know, it will be difficult to actually put a lot of that in place. If I look at one of the areas, there's a piece around data that's coming out, which actually will impact on the way we all communicate through with our clients running through. And that's out for consultation. At the moment, will actually run through, and if unchanged, will become part of a legislative process coming into force around September time. Not a lot of time for people to actually prepare.
Well, it kind of feels like whenever legislation comes out, it doesn't feel like people get a lot of time with it, does it? So, I mean, thinking of the time, I mean, 18 months ago, we would have been on the stage talking all about MTD,
Yep.
and it kind of feels like the millennial bug, because it kind of came and went without too much hassle. Jenny, you dealt with everything MTD for Iris. Do you think that it's been the boom for accountants that some predicted?
To be honest, I've spoken to quite a few different accountants, and I've seen lots of different reactions. So for some, it has been a complete non-event. It's not really changed how they do things, and they're still continuing the way that they always have done. For others, it's been sort of the catalyst they've needed to change their processes and the way they work. So there's a real mixed bag in terms of how MTD has impacted people, I think. And I think it will continue that way for a while.
I mean, it's been quite quiet on the MTD front since it all launched. Is there something big coming that nobody knows about that's coming for MTD?
I'd like to believe that we will definitely get more information in the budget. I think they've got to give a bit more guidance and some clear expectations and dates, and I think that will probably be in the budget next month.
Gotcha. Glenn, obviously you work with the government quite
Yeah,
a lot.
I mean, from my particular perspective and looking at a lot of our members, actually, it was a really good job we had bridging software. Otherwise, we would have ended up with a bit of a disaster running through. If we look at that, it's been a great catalyst for getting people moving and actually taking a lot of their online presence seriously. The question, I think, which is still unanswered is actually, has that investment that many, many businesses have actually made been worth it? And I think we won't know that until we see the next stages of MTD rolling forward. And like you, I would be very surprised and probably even willing to have a bet, as a risk-averse accountant, willing to have a bet that MTD will be mentioned in the budget. And I think, you know, we will end up with dates and times coming out. Hopefully, not the 2021 that they keep on bashing around, and it's pushed out a lot further than that. But, you know, you never know what will come through from a chancellor.
And Glenn, you talk about investment. John, have you seen firms, because you go out there talking to about advisory and things like that, have you seen them investing in different areas outside of MTD as well as MTD?
I think so, but just to pick up on Glenn's point on MTD has been a massive catalyst to drive the digital agenda, and I think it's woken government up, perhaps more than ever, to realise that if they can digitise everything that they look at, then their tax yield's going to increase. And essentially that's their main driver. I think the tax yield in this country is one of the best in Europe, but I think the government reckon they achieve something like 95.4% of the percentage of GDP they expect. So they've got a heck of a lot of money to chase. And things like MTD and the digital agenda, that is their route to do that.
Yeah. And Brian, like us, you're a fellow software developer. What about you? Has MTD had an impact on you?
I think, just to confirm what Jenny was saying there, I think there are two camps. There was those accountants that, you know, are tuned into change, opportunity and threats. And so those people got on it, and they saw it as an opportunity to change the way their clients were working. And then there was another group that did something else, and I'm not sure what they did, but I think the other thing around this, though, for me, is that this lull before the storm. What's got me thinking about this, particularly when you think about the conversation around elements today and what's happening there and the sophistication that's getting built into the back end of all these platforms. And that's been allowed to happen because of, you know, the technology platforms that are available to us, the cloud. I'd sort of pose the question to the audience, is if, as an accountant consultant to the HMRC, given, say you walked in there with an unlimited budget, unlimited legislative change, which is probably true, and you'll see more of that as we're in the Brexiters phase, what would you do next after MTD? And with the power at the back end and getting it cheaper to deploy stuff and easier to deploy stuff on the front end, which is what we've seen today with the Iris tax product, why wouldn't you start auditing these transactions at source? When somebody pays for something, why don't you validate whether that's deductible or not then? And so the question then becomes, what happens to the intermediary around that? And that is the challenge for the accounting profession, is to, you know, that could happen quite quickly because this infrastructure is getting stronger and stronger and quicker. And those that are agile enough to get on and, you know, leverage that are going to survive. Those that don't will just die. And I think that sort of plays into this whole conversation around advisory and consulting.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, right? Because, like we said, there have been some firms that have done a great thing with MTD and have really jumped on it, but then haven't thought ahead of where they're going to go. And it's kind of those successful firms that have taken MTD and have really flourished and are continuing. And Martin, you work with a number of different firms, right? What would you see as kind of the successful characteristics of a great firm?
I think if we link these two together, Steve, we've got all of these pieces of legislation or regulatory change, MTD, auto-enrollment, GDPR, and what is it this week? And I get very frustrated by that, and I think practitioners get very frustrated by that because it inhibits progress and it inhibits practice development. So you have to be just pushing the ball slightly harder up the hill then to really make progress in the face of all of these regulatory changes you have to deal with. So when I see firms really making progress on their net profitability, really making progress on their client acquisition, and by client acquisition I mean grade A client acquisition, I typically find that they've taken responsibility and ownership for growth. So for most of us, you know, the work comes in by referral, we close 95% of it, and that's our growth. And if that tap was ever to be turned off, we would have no plan B. And what I see successful firms do is take control and ownership for each piece of the process that keeps their firm moving. So they take control of the marketing, even though they're not marketeers, and they work out, how do we attract opportunity into the firm? They take control of the actual process of sale, and it's an ugly word that we try to avoid and call it business development or something else. But they take control of actually winning the new work, forecasting the new work, the pipeline, and so on and so forth. They do that. They take control of the technology question within the practice, the app stack, the workflow. What are we using? What are we using? Let's just focus on these 6 things first of all, a piece of general ledger, a piece of tax software, whatever it happens to be, and then think about the rest later and not be overwhelmed by an ecosystem of apps. And then they take care of what is, I think, a major talking point this year and last year, recruitment and retention of talent, which I see coming up everywhere now. But just as they have a pipeline of prospects, they've got a pipeline of people as well. And that's a fairly well-kept secret at this point in time. There's a good few firms quietly building pipelines of people, looking on LinkedIn, building relationships with their local society or chapter of their institute, and just getting an idea of who's who and who's where, and keeping an eye on them, and starting to build relationships with them so that they can start to attract them into the firm. And whether MTD has a big impact, whether Brexit has a big impact, you know there's another one coming along soon. No matter what, there's going to be another one. So we can just forecast that we're always going to have that. So if we allow that to defeat us, then progress doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So we have to take responsibility to say, right, this is an occupational hazard, this regulatory change. It's coming no matter what we do. There's another one. Even if this one blows over, we've got another one coming. It's bound to happen. So let's accept that, and let's take control of our growth, even with that to deal with. And that's what I see the most hungry, the most proactive firms doing.
And it's an interesting point, right? Because we've talked before around how there's a talent gap in the UK for professionals. We've seen it in auditors as well. And that those firms are kind of, like you said, almost building up their backlog ready to bring those people in. And we saw, what was it, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, Glenn, there was a slight dip in the number of people coming in as students. Has that changed now? We see more students and more talent coming into the industry?
Seeing it coming in from more diverse groups, being attracted into the profession. And I think some of that is really people looking and going, actually, this tees me up. These set of skills actually tee me up to be an entrepreneur. Actually, I have a skill set that I can actually transfer going forward. But I couldn't agree more. One of the things that we've really seen coming through is actually connections, and be that as a student level or actually at a firm level. It's firms interacting with one another and actually saying, I'm good at this, and we can do this, and we can help you do this, but not trying to do everything yourself and not trying to reinvent the wheel. And going back to your point about, good firms, successful firms, some of those characteristics, that's what we're seeing out in that marketplace, is making those connections, creating your network around you, and not thinking you can always do everything. You probably don't want to sit down and look through orange and yellow tax books every day. As much as it hurts me to actually say that, being a technical person, it's not going to add value to your business. But actually making those connections, we heard the speaker before go on about, actually, I outsource some VAT. I have some audit professionals I can call on. We're seeing an awful lot more with people looking and going, how can I monetize various aspects running through? And I think that's the connection piece coming through. We're seeing the students as well, and they're also going very much into how do I create those connections and that networks, and what firms are actually attractive to me. And we've had a number of cases where people have chosen firms because of their prospect, not because of what they're actually going to be paid now. They're actually looking at the longer term and saying, what's my exposure to clients? What's my, what's going to be my end benefit running through? Actually, sometimes I don't want just that narrow field that I've typically been offered, or be it a graduate or be it someone from school.
Yeah, it feels like people are moving more away from kind of specialisms and kind of the technical
Absolutely.
aspect of it to the other things. John, you must have seen this with some of the clients you've worked with about them changing their direction.
It is. I mean, just a quick couple of points there. Picking on one of Martin's points, we're seeing a lot of firms spending a lot of time now on their websites, for instance, not just to attract clients, but to attract new recruits, to deal with the talent gap. And I think that's a very sensible thing to do. The other point is, I'm a big believer, and I think what I'd call the tax model is one way of describing what Glenn said, and I think that's a great model, where basically everybody within tax is giving basic tax advice at the bottom, and as you move up, it gets a bit more complicated, but then you get something specific. And rather than say, I've got to learn about this and deliver it myself, as we've said, you bring in the VAT expert, you bring in the R&D expert, you bring in capital allowances expert, whatever it is. But actually, if you replicate that model across the whole of the practice, why can't you outsource all the bits you either don't want to do or can't do anyway?
Yeah, it's an interesting area, right? Because we're seeing as one of the growing trends is more and more firms, like you heard from Kevin, outsourcing a lot of this work, right? And Jenny, some of the software that we're doing right now is to make people's lives easier, to make it more productive. Do you think that we are maybe helping that along a little bit by giving people something that anyone can go and use, rather than making it something only an expert could go and use?
I think it's difficult to get the balance right. Obviously, our intention is always to make it easier for people to use. I don't think that means that anybody can come along and do it. You do need an element of expertise, knowledge to be able to do anything in this industry. But the easier we can make it, the more efficient we can make it, it frees up that time for those people to work on other things, and for people that are less capable or able to be able to help. So yeah, it's a big focus of ours to always make things easier to use and easier to do, but it will never get rid of that need for expertise or understanding.
And I know that a load of people are always scared of technology, right? You always hear people saying around, oh yeah, it's going to replace the accountant. But I mean, crikey, the advice that people give ultimately is from experience rather than something as a processing piece. And John, on the advice side of things, you mentioned earlier that people give different level of advice. Do you think people are giving advice away without, one, realising it, and two, maybe even not charging for it?
Well, I was at an event a couple of months ago, and I asked the audience to say, well, put about 60 people in a room, and I said, put your hands up if you think you do advisory. And about half the room put their hands up. And I said, well, I've got news for you. You all do it all the time. Because from the client's perspective, which is much more important than our perspective, that's what they're receiving. So a simple example might be, I come along to one of you guys, say, I want to set up a business. Straight away, you start asking me questions about what my plans are, what sort of business I want to be, is it seasonal, all these sorts of things. And in response to that, you're going to give me certain points of advice. But we as professionals sometimes just almost don't even realize that that's what we're doing. So we're giving it away, we don't value it ourselves, we don't charge for it, but we're doing it all the time. So the key is to look at how organized and structured we are in terms of audit, accounts, and tax, and be just as organized as we are within advisory, because it's no different. And from the client's perspective, they just want us to look after them, help us improve, better our position. That's essentially what advisory is.
There seems to be a big shift in the industry where people are saying that compliance, we can go and automate as much of that as possible. And that used to be the big breadwinner for most people. But advisory seems to be growing as kind of a more larger proportion to what firms are doing. And Brian, you used to do a lot of speaking with accountants around it. Are you seeing more of them not just using advisory as a buzzword, but actually living and breathing it, seeing it coming into their businesses?
I think you're right. For too long, it's been a buzzword.
Yeah.
And John, you're right. Everyone in this room advises their clients right from day one. Yeah. And I wonder whether we've actually got the wrong title for this. You know, the big four.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? In my opinion, advisory is our internal language. It's what we use to describe it. Yeah. If I'm a client and you say, let me talk to you advisory, I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it should be consulting. And just to have a change of word. But I think there are, and the whole Brexit thing perhaps will be part of this. So if we roll forward to the end of the year, there will be two types of consulting or advisory. There'll be, and I think the one that really will make the difference for accounting firms will be those that get into what I call strategic advisory, sort of the stuff you do, John. And that's around business models. That's about positioning. That's about capacity. That's about functionality. It's about succession. It's about culture, changing that. And I think that sort of connects with what Kevin was talking about in the previous session. Unpacking those real strategic pieces that create the super profits in a business for their clients versus what I would class as operational advisory, which is, yes, automate as much of the transaction processing as you can, and that's certainly happening fast, and get into cash flow, off-balance sheet finance advice, stuff like that. So there's a difference between the two, and you've got to work out which one you want to be in, and then you've got to be able to have the skills to do that. And I think that the firms that I see that are moving into the first one, the strategic advisory stuff, that's where you're going to get the real shifts. And I think Brexit will be an interesting thing that plays out when we get to the end of the year and see what that looks like, because we still don't know what it looks like.
It's true.
Let's say it's we go off the edge, then clients are going to really need some help.
Yeah, and who are they going to turn to, right? Their accountant. And just as a quick question, just on Brian's point, those two types of advisory, just as a quick question to you all, put your hand up if you feel that you do strategic advisory for your clients. That's great. So I can just about see at the back. It looks like a good 50% of the room already feel like they're doing strategic advisory.
Yep.
And John, you work quite closely with them to help accountants to drive up that strategic angle. Is there anything you want to kind of give to the other 50% that maybe aren't doing that?
Well, I think it's worth broadening out the strategic and operational and maybe call that the y-axis and look at an x-axis, because I think there's differences in the size of firms and what they can offer. So, for instance, let's broaden business advisory into what I call whole of client, so the personal side as well as the business side, because the vast majority of firms have got owner-managed businesses, OMBs, so they're not just looking after a company with external shareholders and a professional management team, they're looking after the client's personal affairs as well as their business affairs. So this whole of client approach, I think personally, is almost an advantage to smaller firms, because they haven't got the constraints that some of the bigger firms have got, where they can't work with the whole of client approach. They can only deal with just the business side. So I think it's more than maybe a continuum. I think you can create almost a schematic around it, create a framework, and think about the mix of your client base and where it fits and how you can work with them.
Interesting. So we've seen a couple of trends already emerging from what Martin was saying around kind of the building the bridge to the talent gap, around building in kind of almost a backup for your staff. We've heard around kind of the digital nature of what MTD has done into digitized firms, more going into advisory and strategic advisory. Martin, are there other trends that you're starting to see from working with some accountancy clients?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's recurring trends. When I listen
Is it flares? They're coming back around?
Yeah, flares are going to come back. It's going to be huge. When I listen to the term, we should move from compliance to advisory, is 1992, Paul Dunn. Yep. We should move from fixed pricing or time-based pricing to value pricing, is Ron Baker 35 years ago. And the question then becomes, so why didn't we? Because a lot of time has passed, and a generation has retired, and another generation is about to retire, and we're still where we were largely. And I think those recurring fees prevent us from ever looking beyond, because we didn't come into accounting to be sales and marketing people. And therefore, sales and marketing isn't innate, and it isn't something that we might set a priority towards. But a good friend of this panel, a gentleman called Richard Bruin, has got a lovely way of describing it. And he says that the training for the profession teaches that when the annual accounts are produced, the conversation with the client stops. And when the annual accounts are produced, the conversation with the client should start. And that's, I think, the challenge that we've got as a profession from a mindset point of view is to understand that when we have the numbers, the bread and butter, that's when the conversation starts. Right, what's going to happen? And then we need to go to what we might call the 4 walls of financial literacy. So does the client use and work from budgets on a regular basis? Do they forecast their future at any given time? What about their cash flows? What about their management reporting? What about their investing? You know, you might go, well, that's IFA's job, but we have the financial intimacy with the business owner. They talk to us, not the IFA necessarily, not to the bank necessarily, definitely not to the solicitor, you know, and so they talk to the accountant. And I think technology will make there be a time where we'll have no choice but to accept that we're not in the accounting business, we're in the relationships business. Yeah. And we win what we win on the advisory side by the strength of relationship, by how much a business owner, and I speak as a business owner, willing to put my trust of my future into the hands of my advisor to say, Martin, this way, Martin, go there, Martin, do this. Because I might be very good doing what I do, but I'm not necessarily great running a business doing what I do. And I think you could look at your client bases and say, I could name a few of those. You know, and so it's those people that need the arm around the shoulder. And it's those people that will pay a premium to have your support in areas where they're not strong or familiar. And the one thing I always remember is a firm in Macclesfield, Cheshire, who showed me a list of clients that they had lost over the last, I think it was a 5-year period. And next to each company name, whether it was limited company partnership or whatever it was the code LOC. And I said, oh, yeah, okay, LOC, loss of clients, I've got it. And he went, no, Martin. No, LOC, lack of cuddling. And what he was referring to here was that as a firm, they acknowledge and recognize that there was no need to have lost that client. They didn't get close enough. They didn't find out the true motivations behind the business owner's dreams, aspirations, whatever it happens to be. And as such, the client perceived the accountant as being a provider of compliance services, same as everybody else. And in that case, who's the cheapest, how far away are they, and do I like the look of them, becomes the decision-making criteria. Yeah. As opposed to, can I place my future in your hands? And I think this entire room, if we want to increase in profitability, increase in being written into our clients' strategic plans for years to come, we have to be the people who they trust their futures to.
I mean, there's a lot that you discussed. John, anything you want to pick up on?
Well, just adding to what Martin has said, I mean, some of the conversations we will have with firms when they ask to talk to us will be, how many clients you've got? And you'd be amazed how many firms don't know how many clients they've got. And then you might say, well, okay, so how many services do you offer? And you'd be amazed how many firms don't know how many services they offer. So I won't name them, but a top 20 firm in London, senior partner, quote, if my clients wanted this kind of thing, they would ask for it. And of course, the answer to that is, well, how many services do you offer? And he didn't know. And I'd done my research. He had 23 services on his website. So if the firm doesn't know what they offer, how can they talk to clients about it? And there's some sort of interesting opportunities here. If you get a chance, have a look at a thing called Magic Matrix. Just Google Magic Matrix, and it looks at clients, and it looks at services, and it says, where's the gaps? But it's actually a really good educational exercise in itself to understand your practice. But the sort of things we're finding is that there should be a leverage of advisory fees out of compliance of about 3 or 4 to 1. So putting that in context, you've got a client that's worth $5,000 a year. There's a potential, but I wouldn't say this is for every client, maybe the top 10%, there's a potential of converting that into an extra 3 or 4 times fees from advisory. But there was a guy earlier this morning, I can't remember his name, sorry, Steve.
That'd be David, I think.
He actually gave an example of 8 to 1.
Yeah.
8 to 1. Now, I think that's absolutely fantastic. We've got one of our firms that we work with where there's a 29-year-old director in that business, and he's achieving 8 to 1 ratios. When he first told me about it, quite frankly, I didn't believe him. But then when he showed me all his stats and he talked through what he did, I mean, it's amazing. So he's signing up clients on sort of 2,000-3,000 a year compliance, and he's getting 8 times advisory.
And it sounds like there's a massive opportunity there, but quite a lot of these different firms are going now specific niches as well, right? So some are looking at particular client types and going, right, well, that's worked well for us. Are there any particular niches that you guys are seeing at the moment that are starting to come out? Brian, are there any particular areas that you're seeing accountants driving down as a niche?
Not particularly. You know, the firms I deal with, you know, have, I wouldn't say niche, but certainly specialisms, definitely. But I do wonder whether there is an opportunity here, and it goes back to Callie's presentation this morning around emotional intelligence, vulnerability, and is that, Martin, the cuddling piece?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think that's got to be, and that takes some skills.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just about, you know, they come in and sign their work off for the year, and you give them a cuddle and off they go and everything's fine. It's how do you start to unpack that deep-seated issue that's sitting inside them, and as the business owner, that tends to be that. They put all of their efforts, their life into this business. It's all consuming, and then they get to a point that they hate it. You know, going back to Kevin's presentation before. So I think that's a real opportunity, and you know, the person that has the opportunity to unpack that and unlock it and move them forward and away into safety and you know, a better existence, you know, why not?
And it's interesting. I mean, we talk about the kind of the human aspect of it, the cuddly to it. Glenn, that's not something that is normally taught, right, as part of a profession.
Exactly.
So how are advisory bodies going and helping accountants to go and understand this area more?
We haven't put cuddling into the curriculum yet, but thank you for that idea. I mean, I can see how it will fit into CPD. You know, if you demonstrate it's relevant to your business, actually, you know, a bit of cuddling therapy might work. It goes back actually, Steve, to one of those areas we talked about before, and that entire piece around the connections and networking piece, and an awful lot of the soft skills. Because traditionally, you know, a lot of us will have been brought up with a lot of the hard accounting skills and tax skills. Actually, that's given us the bedrock for a lot of what we do. People pay because actually they want to pass on some of the issues they have, some of the problems they have, some of the concerns they have, and actually, who will look after my family wealth? Who will look after the prospects for me through my lifetime? Actually, my accountant is good. My accountant is my reliable source running through for that. And so a lot of that comes back to those connections and actually communication skills, which Martin has mentioned running through. Professional body-wise, a lot of that is post the examination route, but even under our new syllabus, there are elements in there which pull together some of the ethical side and the business advice side that actually teaches you to go down that advisory and more softer skills approach. So if you haven't had a look, do have a look at some of the new modules on our site. As members, you can actually go in and have a look at those and see what some of your latest talent will be learning coming through.
Brilliant. So just before we kind of head out to questions from the audience through Slido, we talked a lot about the kind of the trends that we're seeing and kind of the opportunities that are there today. But what about tomorrow? What are your guys' kind of predictions for what's the next big thing for accountancy? And John, I'm afraid you're so close to me, I'm just going to ask you first.
I'm not sure it's the next big thing as such, but I think there is a real opportunity for the accountant to position themselves as a true most trusted advisor. I know most trusted advisors overused quite a lot, but almost this facilitative concierge type role where they sit close to the client, it's their relationship, they look after the client, and they do some of their work themselves,
Brilliant. So it sounds like the concierge accountant could be an emerging thing for the future. Glenn, how about you?
I'm going to go back to what all of your clients would say and what I think accountants are actually seeing at the moment. It's actually recognition of the real value you're bringing through in all of the different areas. Actually a recognition that people are actually willing to pay for a lot of that. It's getting out more mainstream, so we see things where people are using, advising on different apps that they're putting in place. Actually not just saying, this is good for your business, but actually we're going to advise this because it will benefit your business in the long term and you will get real value from this. And actually it's a great data source. We're also seeing a lot of the skills being used. So we've just started something with some partners on ADR, on dispute resolution. And some of that relates across to a Singapore convention that's just been signed, which a lot of businesses are going to sign up to. But we're seeing that trend come through in the courts, and actually accountants are really well equipped to solve people's problems. You think of the number of partnership disputes you'll have solved, the number of directors disputes you'll have solved, or as one of our members recently said, I didn't realize I was good at solving divorce problems, but I'm actually getting quite a name for myself at the moment. And it's not their own divorce they're talking about. So we're seeing a lot of that recognition coming through. Actually, there's a lot of streams out there we can charge for and people actually appreciate.
Brian, how about you? What's your prediction?
I guess my response is I don't think there's a next big thing per se. I just think this whole advisory thing perhaps isn't happening as fast as it should have.
Yeah.
To Martin's point, these conversations have been going on for a long time. Maybe we should just liken it to climate change and say that, in the year 2030, there will be no more of that type of work, and that will create the shift. Because it's only when people start saying that, if we don't correct this by this point in time and put a stake in the ground, that people then start to concentrate on, okay, maybe we've got to do something. The interesting thing is I was at a legal conference yesterday, Steve. So these were for legal firms in the UK, less than 20 million in revenue.
Right.
And there was a question asked, which was, what are the 5 things that keep you awake at night? And the first one that came out, no surprise, acquisition and retention of talent. And that's just consistent. All the surveys I've seen in the accounting sector and the legal sector say the same thing. But the interesting one was underneath it, the number 2, which was the question was what are the hurdles that are stopping or impeding the growth of the business or the practice? And the answer to that was the ability to change the mindset within the firm. And in 2019, this question was asked of these legal firms, and it was 28% score. This year, it was 38%. So to me, that really resonated with me yesterday. I thought, hang on, there's a real shift happening here. Because, these things can move by 1 or 2 points, and, nothing's really changed.
Yeah.
But when it shifts that much, I think that's the thing underneath this talent piece that needs to be sorted out. You've got to start with yourself, you've got to start with your why, and then move back and solve that top problem. And I think perhaps we're looking at it the wrong way around here.
Gotcha. So it sounds like a big mindset shift coming as a prediction for you.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Martin, how about yourself?
There's always a silver bullet available to buy in the accounting profession. It's usually available at thoughtremoval.com as well, because rather than thinking or making an effort, just press this button, pay this money, and some system or process or methodology takes over. It never does solve the real problem. So I think for me, when we ask the hands to go up to say, who actually provides advisory to their clients, and a good number of hands went up around the room here, I'd love to see how many hands stood up if we said, and who charged for it as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know, but I would expect the number of the hands to go down at that point. And I think the next big thing in the profession will be when we overcome our own imposter syndrome that Callie talked about this morning. And when we actually decide to perceive the work that we take as standard in the way that the client, perceives it as life-saving or life-changing. And when we start to value our work and price the work and be able to demonstrate the outcomes of the work so that our clients are buying outcomes and results as opposed to service lines, then this professional boom like it's never seen before. And I think that will only happen when enough of our recurring fees are eroded by automation.
Gotcha. And Jenny, finally, for you, any predictions that you can see for the future?
So for me, from what I've seen recently, and especially today, I've had quite a few conversations with people today. For me, the big change that I see is that accountancy practices are becoming businesses rather than accountancy practices.
Yep.
And more than just doing the advisory services, they're sort of stepping outside of their comfort zone and providing services, getting in extra resource, expertise from other divisions to provide those other services. And they're using that client relationship that they've built because they're trusted to be able to guide their clients into these different things. I spoke to a gentleman earlier that he was saying that he doesn't consider his business an accountancy practice anymore. They have an accountancy division, they have solicitors, they have surveyors, but they all have one client base, so they can provide whatever solution or service their client needs all within house. And I think that's, I believe, the way accountancies will go. They'll become more like businesses and service providers rather than just being focused on accounts.
It's really interesting. So maybe accountants know more and business advisors are the way forwards. Right, so excuse me whilst I got my phone out, but I've got some questions from our audience here. And we'll start with the very top one, actually, because it's easier than me having to scroll through. So we've got here, very often clients of SMEs believe that annual fees include advisory. How do you work to change this attitude? That's a great question. Who would like to tackle that one? Glenn, or John, would you like to?
Yeah.
I think the answer to that is actually we've got to be very open and transparent about what's included. I think over the years we've been a little bit almost secretive, and then because if the client doesn't understand, actually that's not their fault, that's our fault for not explaining it properly. So my daughter doesn't do something I've asked her to do. Essentially, I haven't explained it properly, I haven't explained the advantages of that, the benefits of that, and why we're doing it.
You sure it's not selective hearing? You sure it's not selective hearing?
No, I think it's open and transparent, and one way to make that absolutely obvious to them is to give them choices, so they're choosing what they want. And it might be they have a purely compliance package, it might be they have a compliance and advisory package, and it might be they have a compliance with bells and whistles advisory package. Give them the choices, and then there can't be any misunderstandings.
I would agree with John there, Steve. It's essentially a selling issue.
Yeah.
That's what it is. If the client expects it to be in, that's because we didn't educate them otherwise. It's a selling issue. So the way in which the question, I think, then goes on to how do we change that?
Yep.
It's time to do the very, very ugly sitting down with the clients and
That
explaining
awkward
what is and what isn't included, and almost resetting the relationship, which very few practitioners I find have got an appetite to do.
Gotcha.
Because it carries risk.
So I've got a question here. Feels very specific for Jenny here. So, what is the future of VAT filer? Is it MTD compliant for the forthcoming year?
Sorry, what's the future of our VAT filer?
What's the future of VAT filer? So that's our as VAT
VAT
filer.
filer.
Is it MTD compliant for the forthcoming year?
Yeah, completely. Until HMRC or the government change legislation on what's allowed with regards to MTD, our software is completely compliant. It's fully compliant for any sort of bridging solution. So it's got a future until the legislation changes, and then we'll just update for it.
So, Brian, I get one here that sounds very to one of the points you were making earlier. So, don't you think that to be serious and effective at strategic advisory, you need proper training, such as via Mindshop or Vistage?
I agree. I don't think you just wake up tomorrow and say, I'm moving into strategic advisory. I think you do have to acquire those skills yourself, and perhaps go through it yourself as a strategic process so you understand it. So that does look like, well, if we don't have it in our business, where do we get it? And there's certainly those people available to help you. There's a lot of coaches, a lot of consulting people that can help you make that step. But yeah, you've definitely got to go and get it.
Brilliant. And Glenn, one here for you. Do we really need to worry about IR35?
Unfortunately, yes. Really, when we look at it, we look at the latest consultation from HMRC coming out. It's actually all around how can we get businesses to understand what's happening in time for April. You know, as you will have probably seen, or you may not have seen yet, but I'm sure you'll go home and look at this when you get home tonight. House of Lords Committee, we were there yesterday going, what a disaster this potentially is for an awful lot of businesses. So I would say, you know, contact your MP, put in some comments around actually the impact on an awful lot of businesses running through, and see what can be done. But really, in all honesty, I think the best is another postponement. But it does really mean an awful lot of businesses have got a lot of work to do ahead of April to really look at the impact of this. And it's in our findings, it's not really the clients being assessed and being a small business. It's actually, the assessment isn't actually going to take place with a lot of large businesses are going to be forced into having tax deducted. So it's almost like that horrible default scenario. So thanks for that, Steve.
I thought you'd
really
like that one.
appreciated that.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we've got available to us for questions. So please give a round of applause to our panel.